All right. Hi guys. I'm here to talk about a bunch of random stuff, a lot of which I'm not actually driving. So if I'm saying something wrong, please do let me know. So first up, just some updates on style unification. So since last BlinkOn, we automatically renamed most things to match Chrome naming. It was like 9,000 files and like 1 million lines changed, so that was really fun. And there was also a bunch of follow-up patches that kind of missed things that we kind of missed in the initial patches. It turns out it's really easy to miss small issues when you are changing so many lines. On the bright side, at least the Blink reformat role account doesn't own any bugs, so that's good. The Blink C++ style guide is now kind of a much shorter list of additions and exceptions from the Chrome style guide. So there's really two biggest differences are we still allow and encourage mutable references when you're passing something that shouldn't be null. That's just kind of convention. Yes, you can actually smuggle null in if you really want, but it kind of prevents the problem of you decheck every single variable to see if it's not null, because that's like kind of it doesn't scale up super well. And then the other problem is if people aren't sure if something is null, then they just null check it, but like it's actually never null, and that's kind of silly. The other exception is something that was noted in one of the earlier sessions. If something is exposed to web bindings, like the generated IDLs call it, then we still name it with lowercase names. Of course, there's an exception to that as well. If you have metadata override for your IDL method, then we still have uppercase names. So yeah, consistency. So next thing we want to unify is the naming of files. And this is one of the bigger differences. That's the remains. And you have the old one versus the new way. Kent is driving this. I think when you're adding new code, just be consistent with local conventions. Most of the code in Blink is still using the old conventions. So if you're adding code like near legacy code, just follow whatever that is doing. And like in theory, we will update all that automatically. If you do have new code, sometimes some of the scheduler stuff is using kind of the Chrome conventions already. In that case, just follow the local conventions. Like, it's really hard on people if like you have files named with like both styles sitting in the same directory. So try to avoid that. If you're moving files, usually it's okay to keep the original kind of source conventions. Like at this point, the idea is trying to minimize the amount of churn things are going through. So like, use your best judgment, right? And when in doubt, ask tcount. I'm sure they'll have thoughts. Okay. All right, next part is about kind of reducing the number of wrappers. And today, we kind of have a lot of wrappers in WTF and platform for various base types and that sort of thing. And the biggest problem for this is it's really awkward to pass things through the public API, because like what ends up happening is you define a type in public platform, and then like it's really just like type def, where it just forwards to like the base thing. And then like it's really easy to it's really tempting to just write the base type directly sometimes and that sort of thing. And so kind of the goal here is to allow a set of like common types that we think will be useful in both Blink and outside of Blink to just be used directly. And like this kind of avoids the whole charade with you have to go through WTF, but like really it's just a bunch of boilerplate. So currently in progress, I'm working on improving the pre-submit checks for allowed and disallowed C++ types. There's a couple of bugs in the pre-submit script right now, so I'm trying to fix those, and I'm trying to add tests. And if you've ever written Python tests, you know how fun that is. So once this is done, we expect to allow kind of a pretty limited set of types for the time being, mostly like POD types. So that's like baseband, the time types, and also things like optional. We want to also eventually allow things like GFX rect and that sort of stuff, but there's like a lot of questions on how to unify that with the layout code. So I think Dana Jensen and a couple other people on the lab team will hopefully figure that out. And then eventually we also want to allow things like the Chrome's callback system and also things like the ref counting. Right now we have two different ways of ref counting things. We have two different ways of finding things. And a lot of this is, some of this is historical, right? Like the WTF ref counting always started at 1, whereas the Chrome ref counting started at 0, and like trying to figure out a way to make those match and kind of converge in the long term. That's something TZIC is working on right now. And also the callback stuff is something else TZIC has been kind of pursuing. And if you're writing new code, do try to use once callback and bind once where possible. It'll make things easier for us in the long run. And basically, kind of the reason this is so complicated is because Blink's stuff is actively thread hostile in many circumstances. So like if you're binding a WTF string, for example, you have to be really careful not to pass it cross threads unless you actually use cross-thread bind. And the reason is the ref counting isn't thread safe. And we've had kind of a number of bugs in the past where like the ref count is decremented in a racy way and you end up like double deleting the object, that sort of stuff. So we'll get there eventually. We kind of expect the POD stuff to start being allowed pretty soon, like maybe next week or the week after that. Ref counting and callback stuff is kind of a lot longer term project. I don't think there's any kind of set deadline when that'll finish. Yeah, I don't know if we have a mic. What's your question?
It's about the oil pan. When are you supposed to use ref counting when you're supposed to use garbage collection?
I think in general, we prefer to use oil pan where possible at this point. Ref counting is pretty rare these days in Blink, I think, unless it's actually required for like I don't remember what happens to things in the layout tree. Are those still ref counted? Yes, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so the layout tree is still ref counted, but outside of that, I think probably use oil pan.
So basically, we want to use oil pan. So however, there are a couple of objects where the performance of memory is really, really sensitive. And if we put some objects that are created so many times in the performance sensitive path to oil pan, then it will regress performance because it will add unnecessary pressure to garbage collection. For that kind of special case, we might want to use a pointer. So however, basically, we want to use oil pan.
But basically, that's mostly the layout tree, though, right?
Yeah.
So that sort of thing. Outside the layout tree, basically stick to oil pan unless you have a really good reason not to. There's legacy stuff, but ignore it, I guess. Kind of the final bit of this is currently like platform and the controller directories basically explicitly allow anything to be used. I do plan on revisiting this as part of the work, just because it's a pretty broad list of exceptions right now. And like the reason I mentioned this is because a lot of the stuff in platform can leak actually outside of platform if you're not careful. Just because C++ headers are pretty leaky. When you include stuff from like other things, it shows up there by default. So like, yeah, you can use this to bypass like our depth rules, but please don't. Please include what you use. And like the pre-submit check is really only there to try to catch accidental violations. And so, yeah, basically just, follow good code hygiene. And the other thing is like C++ and STL. So C++ 14 is now a thing. So there's like a couple things we can use now that we didn't have before. Most of them probably aren't useful for like most code except for std make unique. So basically, instead of writing WTF make unique, just use the std version now. And there's also like some C++ 14 language features that'll be coming once like there's toolchain updates. I think Jeremy knows.
Yeah, so there's some stuff that's blocked on compiler support, and there's some stuff that's blocked on still using libstd C++, which limits the ways that we can evolve at the moment. So we're hoping to use more of C++ 14 going forward. Join cxx at chromium.org if you want to know more.
Do you know what the timeline is for the cross toolchains being updated?
No,
specifically the libstd C++ stuff?
The discussion on the bug basically went like, we noticed you're still using libstd C++. Can you change?
Okay.
Things. When do you need this? When can you do it? So I don't have a deadline right now.
Can we tell them it's a binary size improvement?
You can tell them whatever you like. I can give you the bug number.
Okay. I don't know. I just thought that might motivate.
Whoever's maintaining the Chrome OS toolchain. I don't know exactly, somewhere inside the Chrome OS team.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So that's sad, but that's C++. we do still kind of ban most container types. So std string, std vector, all that stuff. Please use the WTF versions. They're kind of, we don't have any like benchmarks as of late, so it would be nice to demonstrate that this is still critical. But like the bigger problem with the STL collections is they don't integrate with OilPan, and since most of Blink is an OilPan, that's kind of important. And we also ban like the base containers for the same reason, basically, right? So don't use base string piece, use like WTF string view and that sort of thing. Of course, you have test code. It's kind of the Wild West out there, and I'm just gonna not look at it, and you can use whatever you want there, I guess. Finally, Mojo. This seems to be the popular topic these days. So in Blink today, there's two ways to connect to interfaces, essentially. You can go through the per frame interface provider, or you can go through the process global one, which is platform's get interface provider. And it's really confusing because frame get interface provider is not thread safe, whereas platform get interface provider is. And they also return objects of different types. And we would like to consolidate on basically the interface provider exposed by service manager rather than wrapping it in Blink. There's some work in progress to do this, but yeah, it's pretty messy right now. Actually, I lied. There's actually a third way to connect to interfaces. It's called platform get connector. Please don't use this. New code.
In general, so I'm doing part of the work on that transition from Blink interface provider to service manager interface provider. If you have a worker thread, which is the usual reason why you're using a platform interface provider instead of the one from the local frame, worker thread has a get interface provider method that you should be using instead of the platform get interface provider.
Actually, I have an interesting comment about that, but it'll come in later. Anyway, yeah. So the idea is that we're gonna try to remove platform get connector eventually, but like it'll take a while because there's a lot of tests and things that kind of need to be cleaned up for this. And we will kind of broker all interfaces via basically, we want to broker them via one of the interface provider methods mentioned earlier. This will kind of broker all methods via the browser process, and it makes security team happy. It also makes it easier to use kind of the built-in the test infrastructure that we've kind of created for Mojo. I think Sam McNally, Riley, and a couple others have worked on a lot of stuff for that. And if you have questions about how to use that sort of stuff, you can bug them. So really, the ultimate goal, from my perspective, is we should be trying for three things. One, we should try to associate almost all interfaces that you connect to in Blink with a context. So that means a context as in a document or a worker's execution context. Goal number two, we'd also like to automatically revoke interfaces on context disposal. If you've written Blink code and you got it security reviewed by me, I was probably like, please add a context lifecycle observer, and please like reset all your things manually when the context is disposed. And it kind of sucks to have to write that for everyone. And then finally, goal number three is really kind of a continuation, but make it easy to write code that's correct by default. I don't think that's necessarily true today, and there's like a couple of reasons why. So first, associating interfaces with the context. So Riley just mentioned this, but workers don't really, I mean, they kind of do. It's worker thread get interface provider.
It's a lie. Right now, it's a wrapper around platform get interface provider.
Right.
But it won't be forever.
So it's a lie right now. So right now, all workers actually use the process global Blink interface provider. And this is not ideal for several reasons. One of them is it requires kind of passing origins from the renderer to the browser. And security team doesn't like this because that means like your origin could be spoofed. We have to do extra checks to make sure you're doing the same things and that sort of thing, right? And so the plan is to actually get rid of Blink platform, Blink interface provider, get rid of platform get interface provider. I don't know if that's possible, but like I can dream, right? And we want to have a per worker interface provider. And right now, you kind of have to do two different things depending on if you're in a frame or if you're in a worker. For frame, you go to the frame. For worker, you go to the worker thread. Kind of what I would like to see, I don't know if it's possible, is to add get interface provider to execution context. And then under the hood, maybe this will call worker thread get interface provider. But like for code that just deals with context, I think it'll be easier if you just have to think about it in terms of like execution context.
I see no reason to make a helper function in execution context that does exactly that.
Okay, we can discuss this later. Yeah. The reason I say this, I've seen a number of places where it does like an actual, if this is a document execution context, do one thing, otherwise do another thing for workers. And then it dechecks if it hits the else case, but then this breaks in tests that use null execution context. So that's kind of the reason. Like the abstractions are a bit leaky because you end up kind of depending on the actual like concrete implementations of execution context. So, all right. Number 2 is revoking interfaces when the contexts are disposed. So unfortunately, this is kind of adding back a wrapper probably. But the kind of idea is we'll be able to wrap service manager interface provider. And in Blink, we'll kind of use this wrapper. And the idea is the wrapper will automatically associate the return interface pointers with a context. So like automatically, the right thing will just happen. And we should have comparable bindings, comparable helpers for bindings as well. And there's kind of an open question of what to do if you don't want to reset when the context is disposed. We'll probably provide some sort of like, escape hatch for code that really needs to do that, but I expect it to be relatively rare. But we'll come back to that in a second. It turns out things are really messy. And finally, what is context disposal, right? Local frame often does not change when you navigate. I think this is actually surprising to a lot of people. And this becomes a problem with Mojo because interfaces are kind of associated with frames by default. If you go with the default strategy of registering your thing in render frame host impl and like connecting to it via local frame get interface provider. And so if your interface is actually supposed to be origin bound, there's like a number of these things, the web manifest, password manager, and that sort of thing. And that means like you actually have to remember on your interface to observe navigations and reset yourself if you need to, like if you're navigated. And it gets even worse because Mojo's kind of default strategy is to have lots of message pipes. Like each interface has its own message pipe. But since there's no ordering guarantee between message pipes, it's actually possible for like the navigation IPC to race with the IPCs to your method. And like you may not actually reset in time to avoid races. And so you end up having to associate your interfaces, which means they share message pipes, but we also like prefer not to associate interfaces unless we have to. So this is kind of like a catch-22. All right. What's going on? All right. So what is this business with like local frame versus local DOM window versus document? First, like your normal navigation case basically looks like this. You start with a local frame, local DOM window, and a document. And after you navigate, you get a new local DOM window and a new document. But the frame doesn't change. And like we've encouraged a lot of stuff to be context bound rather than bound to local frame for this reason, right? It's kind of surprising when people learn about this. And yeah, that's fun. But it gets even more fun. So when you navigate from what's called the initial empty document, we can sometimes reuse the original local DOM window. So in this case, you'll get a new document, but you'll get the old window. And there's like a fun bit from the spec about this, but in practice, it looks like this, right? You can open a new window, and you can tell it to navigate somewhere. But that navigation isn't synchronous. So in the meantime, you can inject something into that new window that you open. And then once that, the URL you're navigating to loads, it can actually call the function that was injected, which is kind of crazy. But I guess people do this. Then you have JavaScript URLs, and these always give you a new document, but depending on things, you might get a new window or not. I think this is based on whether or not you're actually navigating from the initial empty document to a JavaScript URL. And so it actually kind of matches the semantics of the first two navigations we talked about, but it's like yet another weird thing to consider. All right, why is it not? Document.open is another kind of confusing one. Turns out we don't actually follow the spec. the spec says something else completely. But in Blink, if you call document.open, you don't get a new document. You get the original document, and you also don't get a new window. So this is also confusing because I think Firefox does it differently. In Firefox, if you like document.open something and then you document.write, you can actually like navigate back and from to this new document that you created. So that's like fun and slightly insane. Why is this thing not working? So then you have something really fun from the past, XSLT. In theory, none of the things that XSLT does should be visible, but actually that's not true. So this is just one other thing. You get a new document, and the new document is supposed to replace the old one in place, and like no code is ever supposed to know about the old document. Kind of works, kind of doesn't. And then we have out-of-process iframes. So with an out-of-process iframe, you switch all the objects. So you get a new frame, you get a new local DOM window, and you get a new document. So like this, lots of different kind of variations. And this is like really confusing and kind of hard to code against because like if you care about binding to an origin, which like most code probably should, there's like a lot of different things to consider. So what should we do? In a perfect world, I think ideally all these objects would have a one-to-one kind of relationship. And so that means like throughout the stack, everything would consistently have the same lifetimes. And you could assume that if you bound your code to a frame, your origin doesn't change and that sort of thing. Because this is a web, there are a lot of edge cases we'll have to consider as we implement this. So one is that weird case of navigations that reuse the same window object. And we'll probably provide a way to steal the window object. This is actually how WebKit is implemented. In WebKit, when you create a new document and it wants to reuse the old window, it actually goes to the old document and steals the window object from that. So we can do that. That's not too hard. But then there's a question of what to do about Mojo interfaces that are already open. Like I mentioned earlier, that you could kind of pass things to that new window. To that new document via like the window object that's persisted. And if you pass like something that's like backed by a Mojo interface, probably you don't want that Mojo interface to like stop being connected just because like the old document went away. And of course, this is kind of in conflict with what I was talking to earlier about things being scoped to context. So this will be fun. I don't know how we're going to resolve it. What happens for JavaScript URLs? Like, do you get a new local frame? I think the answer should be yes. But then you need to like go up to the browser to tell it that you navigated to a JavaScript URL, which feels kind of weird. And like the browser goes through all this, it's not super lightweight to do this to create a new frame. And same thing for document.open. What should happen there? I think in the case of Blink, I'm hoping we can get away with doing nothing. Since we don't actually change these objects today, if we don't have to change them, it's probably easier to just keep it that way. There's some discussion in the specs over what document.open should do. And I'm really hoping that we can keep what we do today because it's a lot easier. Even though it's confusing because document.open can change the document URL. So there's that. XSLT, I'm just going to ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. Questions? Sorry, I know that was a bunch of random stuff.
Talked about sharing, like how these objects get shared. Is this even for cross-origin applications?
Okay, so I didn't cover that detail. That was kind of in the tiny spec details. If you have a cross-origin navigation, we do not reuse the window object. It's only on same origin navigations. Yeah.
So UPIF is compatible with existing code.
Sorry.
UPIF is then compatible with existing code with respect to that.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. That's the short answer.
Okay.
So does the spec in general wants allow sharing this local frame, or like is the spec very precise about it? Like what should we do or no?
The spec doesn't say anything about frames. The spec only talks about windows and documents. So local frame is like kind of additional internal only thing in Blink, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't really say, and I think that's kind of why our implementation is so confusing. There's like several different layers of objects, and like none of the lifetimes like might match what you would expect basically right now.
The spec does something like browsing context, right?
That's true, yeah. But it doesn't ever talk about like swapping browsing context for like out of process iframes and that sort of thing, right? So like to me, browsing context is more like the window proxy exotic object, as it's called in the spec. So yeah.
So then is it right to say that like whenever there's a new document, you can stop reusing the local frame? Like we don't have it in the spec. Is it right to say? I'm not sure.
So could you?
So when you get a new document, you always get a new local frame, something like that, like kind of new browsing context or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think the spec says anything about that, because that's really like an implementation detail, right? But the real question comes to like when you get these edge cases, like with sharing the window object, how do you handle that gracefully? So yeah.
Do any of these weird use cases matter?
I mean, I would love to get rid of JavaScript URLs and like the window inheritance.
But that weird stuff where it depends on bizarre reuse of objects.
I don't think we've
If
ever
people actually do this, we should use counter, right?
It could be hard to use count because we'd have to track which properties were set on the window object before you navigated. So like V8 would have to track them, I think.
Yeah, I think it depends on what properties you set.
Well, like you can set any property you want, right?
Yeah.
And like right now, like to V8, it's just an object. Like it's not tracking any of this stuff, right?
So you track whether information was passed.
Yeah, like
And used.
and used. We could do it, but it would be a non-zero cost. And I don't know how often the window object is like referenced, but probably quite a bit. And so, like, yeah, measuring it would be tricky.
If you can stick anything on the resource here, you can see it's identity change. Like, I think this is probably very slow.
Yeah, we could just try breaking it and see what happens too, I guess.
Like, what origin do we use for access checks when you make a window, navigate it, but then the navigation hasn't committed yet?
So then that new window is same origin to like you're creating context.
So I can use this to pass it across origin reference? Like I can say like w.foo equals here's like my window object.
Well, like so the thing to keep in mind is that window object is only reused if the page that commits in that frame is same origin to like the original empty document. So you can't leak across origins that way. Yeah, like you can leak, like you could pass proxies that represent cross-origin things like windows, right? Are one example of this. But that doesn't actually allow you to violate the same origin policy.
Yeah.
Unless we have a bug.
Okay, I didn't realize that was restricted to the same origin. That helps a lot.
Listen.
So in the current implementation, finding page and IME sometimes requires asynchronous call to the checking the state of the finding page and IME state in the Blink. So this causes when the document associated frame is changed, it sometimes crash after the decheck about the document checking. So is there any good way to solve this issue?
I mean, my answer would be those things should be document scoped, and that's kind of where I'm hoping to go, right? So like if you have a document scope, the idea is once the document is navigated away from, we kind of close the Mojo bindings, so you don't get these like late IPCs that cause you to crash.
Yeah, unfortunately, both IME and finding page does not yet. Or should we move the IME and finding page to the Mojo?
I think people would say yes, is the general answer, right? It goes over legacy IPC today, right?
Yes.
And if we want to get rid of legacy IPC, then we want to move it to Mojo, right?
Oh.
So I think just by nature of wanting to make these sort of interfaces consistent, we will want to move it over to Mojo.
Since yes, frame automatically shut down the Mojo connection, then both the browser will have.
Yeah, that's the idea. Like we have a lot of work to do to get there. Like this whole mess with the frames and documents not really having matching lifetimes is one of the biggest blockers, I think, in this area, and it's something I think at least I'm trying to prioritize it this quarter to see what can happen. Okay, I think that's it.